They say a promise spoken in silence weighs more than any oath shouted in the open. And on that cold morning in the lonely valley, a woman who trusted no man chose not to wake the stranger sleeping 10 feet from her door. The wind moved slow across the red dust, carrying the dry scent of sage and old wood, and Nayeli stood still as stone beneath the pale light, her dark eyes fixed on the man stretched beside her threshold, his boots worn, his coat stiff with travel, one hand resting near a blade that did not belong to him. And for a long moment, she simply watched, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breath as if it might tell her something words never could. He had come out of nowhere the night before, stumbling through the valley like a man chased by something he could not name, saying nothing, asking nothing, and that alone made him dangerous, because in her world, silence was never empty. It always carried truth too heavy to speak. She remembered the first instant she saw him, how the firelight caught the edge of his face, how his eyes did not wander, did not plead, did not challenge, only held still like a man who had already decided his place in whatever would come next, and that unsettled her more than anger ever could. A coyote called somewhere far off, the sound thin and lonely, and the valley answered with nothing, just the slow shifting of wind across dry grass, the kind of silence that presses into your chest and stays there. Nayeli tightened her grip on the small knife at her side, not raising it, not lowering it, just feeling its weight, because she had learned long ago that decisions were not made in moments of noise, but in the quiet spaces before anything happened. The stranger stirred slightly, his brow tightening as if caught between dreams and waking, and she saw it then, the faint mark near his collar, something old, something worn into him like a memory that refused to fade. And her breath slowed without her willing it to, because that mark did not belong to a traveler passing through. It belonged to a past that had already crossed her path once before. She could have stepped forward, could have ended the question before it had time to grow, but she didn't, and that choice settled into the air between them like dust that refused to fall. Instead, she turned her gaze to the horizon where the valley opened wide, empty and unforgiving, miles of nothing stretching beyond sight. And for the first time in many seasons, she felt something shift, not hope, not trust, but something quieter, something more dangerous, the kind of feeling that made a person hesitate when they should act. Behind her, the small cabin stood weathered and still, its wood bleached by years of sun, its door left open just enough to let the morning in, and for a second she imagined what it would mean to let the stranger cross that threshold, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as something else she could not yet name. The thought passed as quickly as it came, but it left a mark, the kind that doesn't show on skin but lingers all the same. The man shifted again, his hand moving just an inch, and Nayeli's body reacted before her mind did, her stance tightening, her breath held, but he did nothing more, only settled back into stillness, and that restraint told her more than any explanation could have. Men who meant harm rarely waited, and men who carried guilt rarely ran. The sun climbed a little higher, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching the space between them until it felt like something real, something that could not be crossed without consequence. Nayeli lowered her eyes for just a moment, enough to break the line between them, and when she looked back, she made her choice without speaking it, without even fully understanding it herself. She turned away first, stepping back toward the cabin, leaving the stranger where he lay, alive, unchallenged, and that was the first promise, the one no one heard, the one that would follow them both long after the valley forgot their footprints, because out here, nothing was louder than the things left unsaid. The valley did not change when the sun climbed higher, but something between them did, though neither of them spoke it aloud. Nayeli moved inside the cabin without looking back, her steps slow and measured, as if the ground itself might question her decision, and for a while the only sound was the soft creak of wood beneath her feet and the distant whisper of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. She set a small clay cup on the table, filled it with water drawn before dawn, and left it there untouched, because she did not yet know if it was meant for him or for herself. Outside, the stranger remained where he had been, not rushing to rise, not calling out, not even turning his head toward the open doorway, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough to make a lesser person uneasy, long enough to make her wonder if he understood the weight of what had been given to him. Minutes passed, then more, until the light shifted again, sliding across the valley floor in slow, steady lines, and finally he moved, not with urgency, but with care, like a man who knew every motion would be seen even if no one watched. He sat up first, hands empty, shoulders relaxed, his gaze falling not on the cabin, but on the horizon beyond it, as if measuring distance, as if deciding whether the road ahead was worth taking. Nayeli stood just inside the doorway, unseen, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him, searching for something she could name, something that would make the choice easier, but all she found was restraint, and that unsettled her more than anger ever had. He rose to his feet slowly, brushing dust from his coat, and for a moment he simply stood there, the wind tugging lightly at the edges of his sleeves, the quiet of the valley pressing in around him like an unspoken question. Then he turned, not toward her, but toward the open land, taking a single step as if to leave, and that was when she spoke for the first time since the night before. "You walk away now. You do not come back." Her voice was low, steady, carrying just enough weight to stop him without force, and he paused exactly where he stood, not turning immediately, not answering, just letting the words settle between them. A second passed, then another, before he finally looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable, his eyes meeting hers through the narrow line of shadow cast by the doorway. "I was not planning to," he said, his voice quiet, not defensive, not apologetic, just true in a way that made it harder to challenge. Nayeli stepped forward then, just enough for the light to touch her face, her posture still guarded, her hand still near the knife at her side, but her gaze steady. "Men like you always plan something," she replied, and there was no accusation in her tone, only the weight of experience. He held her eyes for a moment longer before shaking his head slightly, a small motion, almost lost to the wind. "Not this time," he said, and the simplicity of it lingered in the air longer than any explanation could have. She studied him again, more closely now, noticing the wear in his boots, the careful way he kept his hands visible, the distance he maintained without being told, and slowly, almost against her will, a question formed where certainty had once been. "Then why are you here?" she asked, and this time her voice carried something different, not trust, not yet, but curiosity edged with caution. He did not answer right away, and in that pause, the valley seemed to hold its breath, the wind softening, the distant sounds fading until there was only the space between them. When he finally spoke, his words came low and even, as if each one had been weighed before it was given. "Because I could not go anywhere else," he said, and that was all, no story, no excuse, just a truth offered without protection. Nayeli felt the words settle somewhere deep, not because they explained anything, but because they did not try to, and for a moment she looked away, her gaze drifting to the empty stretch of land beyond him, where the horizon blurred into heat and distance. She knew that kind of answer, knew what it meant to stand at the edge of something with nowhere left to turn, and that recognition, quiet and unwelcome, shifted something inside her that she could not ignore. Without another word, she stepped back and reached for the door, pushing it open wider. Not an invitation, not forgiveness, but something close enough to both that it made the air feel different. "Water is inside," she said, her voice softer now, though no less firm, and she did not wait for his response before turning away. Again, behind her, she heard the faint sound of his boots against the earth, slow, deliberate, stopping just short of the threshold, and for a moment he did not move, as if understanding that crossing that line would change more than either of them was ready to name. The wind slipped through the open doorway, carrying dust and light into the room, and Nayeli stood still beside the table, her hand resting near the untouched cup, her breath steady but her thoughts anything but outside. The stranger remained just beyond the door, neither leaving nor entering, and in that space, in that fragile distance held by silence alone, the promise between them grew, not spoken, not defined, but real in a way neither of them could deny. The doorway remained open, and still he did not cross it, and that told Nayeli more than any promise ever could. She could feel him there, just outside, not moving forward, not stepping away, like a man who understood that some lines were not drawn in the dirt, but in the space between two people who had no reason to trust each other. The cup of water sat untouched on the table, catching a thin strip of sunlight that slid slowly across the wood, and for a moment she wondered if he would leave. Before it ever cooled, if this quiet standoff would end the way most things did out here, with distance instead of decision. But then she heard it, the faint shift of weight, the soft sound of leather against worn boards, and when she turned slightly, not enough to face him, just enough to see the edge of his shadow stretch across the floor, she knew he had stepped inside, not far, just past the threshold, just enough to accept what had been offered without taking more than he was given. He did not speak, and neither did she, and that silence wrapped around them like something old and familiar, something that did not need to be broken to be understood. He moved carefully, each step measured, as if the room itself might reject him if he moved too quickly, and when he reached the table, he paused, his hand hovering near the cup before finally closing around it, lifting it slowly, taking a single drink, then setting it back exactly where it had been. Not a drop spilled, not a sound made. Nayeli watched from the corner of her eye, noting every detail. The way he kept his gaze low, the way he avoided turning his back completely, the way he stood as though ready to leave at the first sign he was no longer wanted, and something in that restraint pressed against the edges of her certainty. "You do not act like the others," she said quietly, not looking at him, her voice steady but edged with something she could not quite name. He did not answer right away, and when he did, his words came slow, like they had traveled a long road before reaching her. "The others had somewhere to be," he said, and there was no pride in it, no bitterness, just a simple truth that seemed to settle into the room like dust. Nayeli turned then, fully this time, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, searching again for something she could hold on to, something that would make sense of him. But all she found was that same stillness, that same quiet refusal to explain more than necessary. "And you do not," she replied, and it was not a question. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and for a moment the distance between them felt less like a barrier and more like a shared understanding neither of them wanted to name. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that did not belong to the valley, distant at first, then clearer. The rhythmic beat of horses moving across open ground, not close yet, but coming. Nayeli's body tensed. Before her mind caught up, her hand instinctively lowering toward her side, her gaze snapping toward the horizon beyond the open doorway. Elijah heard it too, his posture changing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders tightening, his head turning just slightly as he listened, measuring the distance, the number, the intent behind the sound. Neither of them spoke for a long second, because neither of them needed to. "They are not passing through," Nayeli said finally, her voice low, certain, and Elijah did not argue. He stepped back from the table, not reaching for a weapon, not making any move that would threaten her, only shifting his position so that he stood where he could see both her and the valley beyond, placing himself in a line that made no sense unless he meant to stay. Nayeli noticed that, and it unsettled her more than the sound of approaching riders ever could. "You should leave," she said, though her voice lacked the force it had before, and for the first time since he arrived, Elijah did not even pretend to consider it. "Not this time," he answered, the same words as before, but different now, heavier, anchored by something that had not been there when he first spoke them. The sound outside grew clearer, the distance closing inch by inch, and the air inside the cabin shifted, tightening, drawing them both into a moment neither of them had chosen but both understood. Nayeli looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just the stranger who had crossed into her valley, but the man who had stepped inside her door without taking more than he was given, the man who stood now without a weapon, without a demand, without anything except the quiet decision to remain. And in that moment, something inside her shifted again, not enough to trust, not enough to forgive, but enough to hesitate in a different way than before. The wind pushed against the open door, the sunlight shifting across the floor, and the sound of horses carried closer still, steady, inevitable, and Nayeli felt the weight of the choice forming again, not in her hand, not in the knife at her side, but in the space between them, where silence had already said more than words ever could. If you have listened this far, leave a comment and a like, and remember this moment, because what comes next will test every promise made without a single word. The sound of horses did not rush the valley. It settled into it, steady and certain, like something that had already decided how this would end long before it arrived. And Elijah stood just inside the doorway, not moving forward, not stepping back, his eyes fixed on the horizon where dust began to rise and thin, drifting lines that caught the morning light. Naeli felt it before she fully saw it. That quiet shift in the air when strangers carried intent with them, when the land itself seemed to hold its breath, and she moved without thinking, one step to the side, placing the wall at her back, her gaze never leaving the open stretch beyond the cabin. "How many?" she asked, her voice low, controlled, and Elijah did not answer right away, his head tilting slightly as he listened, counting not just the rhythm but the spacing, the weight behind each step. "4, maybe 5, he said finally, his tone even, not alarmed, not dismissive, just certain in a way that made the number feel heavier than it should have. Naeli nodded. Once, more to herself than to him, her mind already moving through the paths she knew, the places where the land dipped just enough to hide, the narrow lines between rock and shadow where a person could disappear if they moved before they were seen. But she did not move toward them, not yet, because something in the way Elijah remained where he was held her there. Outside, the riders grew closer, their shapes forming against the pale distance. Dark figures against the light, not rushing, not spreading out, just coming straight. And that alone told her they were not searching blindly. They were following something, a trail, a sign, a piece of truth that had led them here. "They are not looking for me alone," she said quietly, and Elijah's eyes shifted just enough to meet hers, not surprised, not questioning, only acknowledging what had already been understood. "No," he replied, and that single word settled between them with more weight than any explanation. Naeli studied him then, really studied him, the way his stance had changed, the way he had placed himself where he could be seen first, where anyone approaching would notice him before they noticed her, and that choice pressed against her thoughts in a way she did not welcome. "You know them," she said, not accusing, not yet, but the question was there all the same. Elijah did not look away, and that was answer enough before he even spoke. "I know the kind," he said, and there was something in his voice now, something quieter, something that carried memory without needing to name it. The riders closed another few yards, the sound of hooves clearer now, the faint jingle of gear carried on the wind, and the valley seemed smaller with every step they took. Naeli's hand hovered near her side, not gripping the knife, not yet, but ready if it came to that, and she felt the old instinct rise, the one that told her to disappear, to become part of the land before the land turned against her. But she did not move, because Elijah had not moved, and that stillness held her in place. "If you stay, they will see you," she said, her voice sharper now, edged with urgency she did not try to hide, and for the first time since. He stepped inside. Elijah allowed himself a faint shift, not retreat, not advance, just enough to square his shoulders toward the open valley. "That is the idea," he answered, and there was no bravado in it, no challenge, just a simple statement that made the air feel thinner. Naeli felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not exactly, but the awareness that this moment was no longer hers alone, that whatever choice had been made when she let him remain had already begun to unfold beyond her control. The riders were close enough now that she could make out details, the cut of their hats, the way they sat their horses, the straight line they held as they approached, and she knew then that they would not turn away, not without something to show for the miles they had crossed. Elijah stepped forward then, just one step, moving out into the light, placing himself fully in view, his hands empty, his posture calm, and Naeli watched him with a stillness that mirrored his own, her mind tracing every possible outcome, every path that could lead away from this, and finding none that did not begin with what he was about to do. "You do not owe me this," she said, the words coming before she could stop them, and for a brief second, something flickered in Elijah's expression, not quite a smile, not quite regret, just recognition. "I know," he said, and that was all, no more, no less. The riders slowed as they drew within 100 yards, their formation tightening slightly. their attention shifting toward the lone figure standing before the cabin, and the valley held its breath again, the wind easing, the dust settling just enough to make everything feel sharper, closer, more certain. Nayeli remained in the shadow of the doorway, unseen for now, her eyes fixed on Elijah as he stood there, not reaching for anything, not calling out, simply waiting. And in that waiting, she understood something she had not wanted to before, that this was not about escape, not about survival in the way she had always known it, but about something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be real. The distance between them had not changed, but it felt different now, no longer a line that separated, but one that connected in a way neither of them had asked for. And as the riders came to a slow halt, the moment stretched thin, balanced on the edge of what would come next, held together by nothing more than the silence they had chosen to keep. The riders did not rush forward when they reached the edge of the clearing. They slowed, then stopped, their horses shifting beneath them as if they too could feel the weight of what stood waiting ahead. And Elijah did not move from where he stood, his boots planted in the dust, his hands open at his sides, his gaze steady but not challenging. And for a long second no one spoke, the kind of silence that stretches thin and sharp, where every breath feels louder than it should. Nayeli remained, just inside the shadow of the doorway, unseen, her eyes fixed on the men beyond the valley, watching the way they held themselves, the way their attention settled on Elijah first. And she understood then that he had been right to step forward, that whatever trail had led them here had already pointed toward him. One of the riders shifted slightly in the saddle, leaning forward just enough to study Elijah more closely, his posture not aggressive, but not relaxed either, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you are close to something you have been searching for. You are a long way from any road, the man called out, his voice carrying across the open space, calm, controlled, and Elijah answered without raising his own voice, letting the wind carry his words back. So are you, he said, and there was no edge to it, no challenge, just a simple truth that hung between them. The rider tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer, then let out a breath that might have been a quiet acknowledgement. We are looking for someone, he said, and though he did not name her, the weight of it shifted toward the cabin without needing direction. Elijah did not turn, did not glance back, and that alone told Nayeli everything she needed to know about the line he had chosen. You found someone, Elijah replied, and the words were careful, measured, neither denying nor confirming, but placing himself exactly where he needed to be. The riders exchanged brief looks, small movements that spoke more than words, and the lead man nodded once, as if a decision had already been made before this moment began. We are not here for trouble, he said, though the valley did not believe him, and neither did Nayeli, because men who rode this far with purpose did not turn away empty-handed. Elijah remained still, the wind tugging lightly at his coat, the sun casting a long shadow behind him that stretched back toward the doorway where Nayeli stood hidden. Then you will not find it here, he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something steady and rooted, not loud, not forceful, but certain in a way that made the space between them feel smaller. The lead rider studied him for a long moment, his gaze narrowing slightly as if trying to place something just out of reach, and Elijah held that look without flinching, without looking away. And in that exchange something passed between them, something old, something unspoken. We have seen you before, the rider said finally, and the words did not land like a threat, but like a memory being pulled into the light. Nayeli felt it then, the shift she had sensed before, the quiet connection between Elijah and the men beyond the valley, and her grip tightened at her side, not on the knife, but on the choice forming again, sharper now, more defined. Elijah did not deny it, did not explain, and that silence answered more than any defense could have. Maybe you have, he said, his voice unchanged, and for the first time the rider's posture shifted, not forward, not back, just enough to show that this was no longer a simple search. The horses moved slightly, restless under the tension that had settled into the air, and the wind carried a thin line of dust between them, blurring the edges of the moment without breaking it. Nayeli's eyes moved from Elijah to the riders and back again, reading what she could, piecing together the fragments that had not yet been spoken, and she understood now that whatever stood between them had begun long before this morning, long before he stepped into her valley, and that truth sat heavy in her chest. "If you are done looking," Elijah said after a moment, his tone quiet but firm, "you should turn back." And it was not a command, not quite, but it carried enough weight to make the riders hesitate. The lead man let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting past Elijah for just an instant, toward the cabin, toward the shadow where Naeli stood, and though his eyes did not settle there, the intent behind that glance did not go unnoticed. "We do not leave empty-handed," he said, and this time there was something firmer beneath the calm, something that pressed against the edges of the moment. Elijah shifted his stance slightly, not stepping aside, not closing the distance, just grounding himself more firmly where he stood. And in that small movement, Naeli saw the truth he had not spoken, that he had already chosen how this would unfold. The valley held its breath again, the sunlight sharpening, the wind easing as if even the land waited to see what would come next, and Naeli felt the weight of it settle over her, the choice no longer distant, no longer something she could delay. She looked at Elijah, really looked, seeing not just the stranger who had stepped into her life, but the man who now stood between her and the world beyond the valley. And in that moment, she understood that whatever promise had been made in silence had already begun to shape what would follow, whether she wanted it to or not. The wind shifted again, slower this time, as if the valley itself had grown tired of holding its breath, and Elijah remained where he stood, unmoved by the weight pressing in from all sides, his gaze steady on the riders who had not yet decided whether to leave or stay. And in that fragile pause, something deeper surfaced, something that had nothing to do with distance or territory, but everything to do with memory. The lead rider leaned forward slightly in his saddle, studying Elijah with a sharper eye now, no longer searching, but recognizing. And that recognition carried a quiet certainty that could not be undone. "You walked away once," the man said, his voice lower now, less for the valley and more for the man standing before him. And the words landed differently, not as a question, not even as an accusation, but as a fact that had waited a long time to be spoken. Naeli felt the shift before she understood it, the way the air tightened not with danger, but with truth rising too close to the surface, and her eyes moved back to Elijah, searching for the reaction he could no longer hide. He did not flinch, did not deny it, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said. "I did," Elijah answered after a moment, his voice quiet, steady, and without defense, and the valley seemed to lean in around those two words. The riders exchanged glances again, but this time there was no confusion in them, only confirmation, and the lead man nodded slowly, as if a missing piece had finally found its place. "Most men do not come back after that," he said, and there was something in his tone now, something that was not quite judgment, not quite respect, but something that sat between the two. Elijah let out a slow breath, not heavy, not relieved, just real, and his eyes drifted for the briefest second toward the ground before returning to the men before him. "Most men have somewhere else to go," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that did not need to be explained. Naeli felt that answer settle deep, deeper than the words themselves, because it was not just about distance, it was about choice. About the moment a man decides to stop running even when there is nothing waiting for him at the end of the road. Her gaze sharpened, her thoughts moving faster now, piecing together what had only been fragments before, and she understood then that whatever had brought Elijah here was not chance, not accident, but something unfinished, something he had carried longer than he should have. The lead rider shifted again, his posture easing just slightly, though the line between them remained unbroken. "Then you know why we are here," he said, and this time there was no need to speak her name, no need to point toward the cabin, because the truth had already stepped into the open. Elijah nodded once, a small motion, but one that closed the space between past and present in a way nothing else could. "I do," he said, and his voice did not waver. Naeli felt the ground beneath her steady, not because the situation had changed, but because it had finally become clear, and clarity, even when it cut deep, was something she understood. She stepped forward then, just enough for the light to catch her face, her presence no longer hidden, no longer something that could be ignored. and the rider's attention shifted to her in an instant, not startled, not surprised, but focused. Elijah did not turn toward her, did not break the line he had drawn, and that choice, that refusal to look back, told her more than any explanation could have. The lead rider's gaze settled on Nayeli, his expression unreadable, but the intent behind it clear enough. "We are not here for you alone," he said, and the words carried a different weight now, one that stretched beyond the valley, beyond the moment, into something older, something that had been set in motion long before any of them stood here. Nayeli held his gaze, unflinching, her posture straight, her voice steady when she spoke. "Then you came to the wrong place," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, only the quiet strength of someone who had already lost too much to give anything else away. The wind moved between them again, carrying dust and silence in equal measure, and for a long second no one moved, no one spoke, because the truth had already been laid bare in the space between them. Elijah stood there, still as ever, but something in him had shifted, something that could not be seen, only felt, the weight of a choice that had finally reached its end. Nayeli looked at him then, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a man standing at the edge of something he could not step back from. And in that moment, she understood that whatever came next would not be decided by force, or fear, or even history, but by something far quieter, something that had already begun the moment she chose not to wake him at her door. The valley exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to let the moment breathe, and the riders remained where they were, waiting, watching, as if they too understood that the next move would not come from them. And somewhere between the dust and the silence, between the past that refused to stay buried and the present that demanded an answer, a promise held its ground without a single word spoken. And if you have stayed with this story to this moment, thank you for listening this far. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt decided, like something had already been agreed upon long before any of them understood the terms. And Elijah remained where he stood, not shifting his weight, not reaching for anything, simply existing in that narrow line between the riders and the woman behind him. And for the first time since they arrived, the lead rider eased back slightly in his saddle, not retreating, but reconsidering. Nayeli felt it too, that subtle change in the air. The way tension no longer pressed forward but began to fold inward, and she stepped another inch into the light, no longer hiding, no longer waiting to be discovered, her presence now part of the moment rather than apart from it. The wind moved gently across the valley, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and sun-warmed wood, and in that quiet, the lead rider spoke again, his voice no longer searching, no longer testing, but steady in a way that suggested he had reached the edge of what he came to find. "It was never meant to end here," he said, and though his eyes rested on Nayeli, the words were meant for Elijah, and Elijah understood that without needing to ask. "It was not meant to end anywhere," Elijah replied, his tone low, measured, as if he had spent a long time thinking about that truth before speaking it aloud. Nayeli's eyes moved between them, catching the thread that ran beneath their words, the part that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with something older, something carried across miles and years until it found this place. "Then why come back?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet not with force, but with clarity, and both men turned their attention to her, not surprised, but acknowledging that the question had been waiting to be spoken. Elijah did not answer right away, and in that pause, the valley seemed to listen, the wind softening, the distant world falling away until only the three of them remained in that narrow space of truth. "Because leaving did not change anything," he said finally, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to lessen the weight of those words, only the quiet acceptance of what they meant. Nayeli felt that answer settle deep, not because it explained him, but because it did not try to, and for a moment she looked away, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the light stretched wide and empty, and she realized that she understood that kind of answer more than she wanted to. The lead rider watched them both, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer pressing forward, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something different, something that had not been there when he first arrived. "We were told you would run," he said to Elijah, "that you would keep running until there was nothing left to follow." And Elijah let out a slow breath. Not heavy, not relieved, just real. I thought I would, he said, and the admission did not weaken him. It steadied him. Naeli's eyes returned to him then, sharper now, searching for the man beneath the silence, the one who had stepped into her valley without asking, without explaining, and had chosen to stand where he stood now without turning back. But you did not, she said, and it was not a question. Elijah shook his head slightly, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than any long explanation. No, he said, and that single word settled into the space between them like something final. The wind moved again, brushing past the riders, stirring the dust at their horses' feet, and for the first time since they arrived, the line between them seemed less like a boundary and more like a place of decision. The lead rider studied Elijah one last time, his gaze no longer searching, no longer measuring, but understanding, and after a long moment, he nodded, a small, deliberate gesture that carried more meaning than any command. Then it is not our place to finish what was not ours to begin, he said, and the words hung in the air, quiet but certain. And the other riders shifted slightly, their posture easing in a way that spoke of agreement without needing to say it aloud. Naeli felt the weight lift, not completely, not all at once, but enough to let her breathe again, without feeling the valley press against her chest, and she watched as the lead rider turned his horse slightly, not rushing, not retreating, just beginning the slow movement away from the line that had held them all in place. Elijah did not move until they did not lower his guard until the distance between them widened by a few yards, and even then, he remained still, watching, waiting, as if making sure the moment truly passed before allowing himself to believe it. Naeli stepped forward fully now, no longer in shadow, her presence clear in the open light, and for the first time since he arrived, Elijah turned toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet her eyes without breaking the quiet that had carried them this far. And in that look, there was no victory, no relief, only the shared understanding that something had shifted, something that could not be undone, something that had been decided not by force, but by the choice to stand still when it would have been easier to walk away. The riders did not look back as they began to leave, and that, more than anything, told Naeli the moment had truly passed, because men who doubted their decision always turned once more before disappearing into the distance. But these men did not. They moved with the quiet certainty of those who had seen enough and chosen not to carry it further. The sound of hooves softened gradually, fading into the wide breath of the valley until it became nothing more than a memory carried on the wind, and Elijah remained standing long after. They were gone, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if making sure the past did not circle back when no one was watching. Naeli watched him in silence, studying the stillness he held on to even when there was no longer anything to hold against, and slowly, almost without noticing, she stepped closer, her boots pressing lightly into the dust that had not yet settled from what had just passed. "They knew you," she said, her voice low but steady, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the truth between them where it could not be ignored. Elijah did not answer right away, and when he finally turned to face her, the movement was slow, deliberate, as if he understood that whatever he said now would not change what she already saw. "They knew what I was," he said, and the words carried a weight that settled deeper than anything he had spoken before. Naeli's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. The way someone looks when they are no longer searching for answers but measuring the ones already given. "And what are you now?" she asked, and there was no softness in it, only clarity. Elijah held her gaze, not deflecting, not retreating, and for a moment it seemed as if the valley itself had gone quiet again, waiting for something it had not yet heard. "Someone who stayed," he said, and the simplicity of it made the truth heavier, not lighter. Naeli felt something shift in her chest, not trust, not forgiveness, but something that refused to fit into the shape she had known before, and she looked away for a brief second, her eyes drifting toward the empty horizon where the riders had vanished. "Staying does not change what came before," she said, and her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had lived with consequences long enough to understand their weight. Elijah nodded once, not disagreeing, not arguing, just accepting what she already knew. "No," he said, "but leaving did not either, and that quiet answer settled between them like a stone placed gently on the ground, unmoving, undeniable. The wind moved through the valley again, softer now, carrying away the last trace of dust, and for the first time since morning, the land felt like itself again, open, wide, and silent in a way that did not press against the chest. Naeli stepped past him then, moving toward the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning the distance out of habit more than fear, and Elijah did not follow immediately. He remained where he was for a moment longer, as if giving her the space she had not asked for but still needed. When he finally moved, it was only a few steps, enough to stand beside her without closing the distance completely, enough to share the same line of sight without claiming it. "You could have told them," she said after a moment, her gaze still fixed ahead. "You could have pointed them here and walked away," and though her tone remained steady, the meaning beneath it was not lost. Elijah let out a slow breath, the kind that comes from carrying something too long and finally setting it down where it could be seen. "I already walked away once," he said, "and that was all. No more, no less." Naeli turned her head, slightly, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye, and in that glance she saw not the stranger who had arrived the night before, but the man who had chosen not to repeat the same silence that had followed him here. The space between them remained, but it no longer felt like something that needed to be crossed, only something that needed to be understood. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows now, pulling the valley out of the long stretch of morning and into something clearer, something harder to hide within, and Naeli felt the weight of what remained, not the riders, not the past, but the man standing beside her. "Why this place?" she asked quietly, and the question carried more than curiosity. It carried the need to understand why his road had ended here, at her door, in her valley. Elijah looked out over the land, his eyes tracing the line where sky met earth, and for a moment it seemed like he might not answer at all. But then he spoke, his voice low, steady, and certain in a way that made it feel like he had known the answer long before she asked. "Because it is the first place I did not leave," he said, and the words settled into the space between them, not asking for anything, not expecting anything, just existing as they were. Naeli held that answer for a long second, letting it sit, letting it shape itself into something she could understand, and slowly, almost without realizing it, she nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement of something that had finally been spoken out loud. The valley stretched before them, quiet and unchanged, but the space they stood in was no longer the same, and neither of them moved to break that stillness, because for the first time since he arrived, there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, only the quiet weight of what had already been decided without a single word. The valley did not rush to fill the silence they left behind. It simply returned to what it had always been, wide and patient, as if it had seen moments like this come and go without ever needing to remember them. And Naeli stood at the edge of the clearing a while longer, her eyes tracing the distant line where the riders had disappeared, making sure there was no shadow left behind, no second path circling back. Beside her, Elijah remained quiet, not pressing forward, not stepping away, his presence steady in a way that no longer felt like intrusion but had not yet become belonging. The sun had climbed high enough now to burn the cool from the morning air, and the heat settled across the land in slow waves, pressing down on everything without urgency, without force, just constant. Naeli turned back toward the cabin, her steps measured, her thoughts slower now, not because there was nothing left to consider, but because there was too much, and she knew better than to rush what could not be undone. Elijah watched her move, then followed after a moment, keeping that same distance he had held since the beginning, not closing the space unless it was offered, and even then, not taking more than he was given. Inside, the cabin felt different, not safer, not lighter, just changed in a way that could not be named, the kind of shift that happens when something unseen settles into the walls. Naeli moved to the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge where the cup still sat, and she lifted it slowly, noticing the faint mark left behind from where his hand had rested, and for a brief second, she held that small detail longer than she should have. "You should rest," she said without turning, her voice calm, not soft, not distant, just even, as if the words had already been decided before she spoke them. Elijah did not answer right away, and when he did, it came low, almost careful. "I have rested enough," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he did not mean sleep. Nayeli set the cup down again, the sound quiet against the wood, and turned to face him, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. "Then you should decide," she replied, and this time there was no room for anything else beneath the words. Elijah met her gaze, not avoiding it, not stepping away from it, and for a moment the air between them held that same quiet tension it had before the riders arrived, but different now, shaped by what had already passed. "I did," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty left to hide behind. Nayeli studied him, searching again for something she could measure, something she could weigh against what she already knew, but all she found was that same stillness, that same refusal to pretend. "Staying is not the same as belonging," she said, her voice carrying the calm truth of someone who had seen many come and go without ever truly arriving. Elijah nodded once, not disagreeing, not correcting, just accepting the line she had drawn. "I know," he said, and the honesty in it settled heavier than any promise. The wind slipped through the open doorway, moving across the floor in a slow breath, lifting the edge of a worn cloth near the wall, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to fill the space that words could reach. Nayeli turned away first, moving toward the small window that looked out over the valley, her eyes drifting across the land she knew better than anything, the ridges, the dry brush, the narrow paths that only revealed themselves to those who listened closely enough. "You brought them here," she said, after a long silence, not turning back, not raising her voice, just placing the truth where it belonged. Elijah did not answer immediately, and that pause told her more than any denial would have. "Yes," he said finally, and there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to explain it away. Nayeli closed her eyes for a brief second, not in anger, not in grief, but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when something already understood is spoken out loud. "And you stood in front of them," she continued, her voice steady, her gaze still fixed on the horizon beyond the window. "Yes," Elijah answered again, and this time there was something quieter beneath it, something that did not ask for forgiveness but did not run from it either. Nayeli opened her eyes, the light catching in them for just a moment before she turned back toward him, her expression unchanged, her posture still. "Why?" she asked, and this time the question was not about the riders, not about the valley, but about him. Elijah held her gaze, and for the first time since he arrived, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not fear, not regret, but something closer to truth than anything he had shown. "Because leaving you would have been the same as before," he said, and the words landed quietly, but they did not fade. Nayeli stood there, holding that answer in the space between them, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted, not enough to erase what had been, not enough to name what might come, but enough to change the way she looked at the man standing in her doorway. The valley outside stretched wide and unchanged, but inside that small cabin, something had moved, something that could not be undone, and neither of them spoke again, because for the first time, the silence between them no longer felt like distance, but like something they both understood. The light shifted slowly across the cabin floor, inch by inch, as if time itself had decided not to rush what stood between them, and Nayeli remained still where she stood, her eyes locked on Elijah, not searching anymore, not questioning in the way she had before, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be undone by words alone. Elijah did not look away, and that was the first thing that mattered, because men who carried nothing often looked elsewhere, but men who carried truth stood where they were and accepted the weight of being seen. The air between them held steady, not tense, not fragile, but full, like something waiting to settle into its final shape. Nayeli took a slow breath, the kind that comes when a decision begins to form long before it is spoken, and she stepped forward, closing part of the distance between them, not enough to erase it, but enough to change it. Elijah did not move, not even a fraction, and that stillness spoke louder than anything he could have said. "You stayed," she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, no longer guarded, but carrying the weight of acknowledgement rather than suspicion. Elijah gave the smallest nod, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged. "Yes," he answered, and the word did not try to become anything more than it was. Naeli studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching not with uncertainty, but with clarity, and then she turned away, moving past him toward the doorway, her steps slow, deliberate, as if she were walking through something unseen. Elijah watched her go, his eyes following the line of her movement, but he did not step after her. Not yet, not until she reached the threshold and stopped. Outside, the valley lay open, unchanged, wide and quiet beneath the midday sun, and the horizon held no trace of the riders who had passed through, only distance and light, and the kind of stillness that made a man think about what he carried with him. Naeli stood there for a moment, looking out, letting the silence settle one last time, and then she spoke without turning back. "There is a path beyond the ridge," she said, her voice steady, even. "It leads west, away from here, away from everything that followed you." Elijah heard the words clearly, and for a second, something moved in his chest. Not hesitation, not fear, but the simple recognition of what she was offering. "You would show it to me," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet understanding. Naeli shook her head slightly, though he could not see it from where he stood. "No," she replied. "You already know how to leave." The wind moved lightly through the doorway, carrying dust and warmth into the room, and Elijah stepped forward then, not rushing, not forcing the moment, just moving until he stood a few feet behind her, close enough to hear her breath, far enough to respect the space she still held. "And if I do not take it," he said, his voice low, not demanding, not pleading, just placing the truth where it belonged. Naeli did not answer immediately, and in that silence, the valley seemed to stretch even wider, as if making room for whatever choice would come next. "Then you stay," she said finally, and her voice carried no judgment, no expectation, only the simple weight of consequence. Elijah let that settle, the words sinking deeper than any instruction ever could, and for a moment he looked past her, out into the open land, tracing the line she had described without needing to see it. The path was there, somewhere beyond the ridge, leading away from everything that had brought him here, and for the first time, it did not pull at him the way it once had. Naeli turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his again, and there was something different in them now. Not trust, not yet, but something that no longer pushed him away. "If you stay," she continued, her voice quieter now, "you do not bring the past with you again." Elijah held her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of everything that had followed him seemed to gather in that space, asking one last time if he would carry it forward or finally set it down. "I will not," he said, and this time the words were not just spoken, they were chosen. Naeli watched him closely, not for the words, but for what stood behind them, and what she saw was not a man asking to belong, not a man trying to be forgiven, but a man who had finally stopped moving long enough to face what he had been. The wind eased again, the light shifting slightly as the sun climbed higher, and the valley remained as it always had, quiet, patient, unchanged, but something within it had settled into place. Naeli stepped back from the doorway then, not inviting him in, not asking him to follow, just making space where there had been none before, and Elijah stood there for a second longer before moving as well, not stepping ahead of her, not falling behind, but simply standing where he was meant to stand. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty, no longer uncertain. It was filled with something neither of them needed to name, something that had been built not by words, but by the choices they had made when it would have been easier to walk away. And in that quiet, under the wide and endless sky, the promise that had never been spoken finally took its shape, not as a vow, not as a claim, but as something far simpler and far stronger, the decision to remain when leaving would have cost less. The valley did not ask for proof of what had been said. It never had. It simply held what was given to it, and let time decide whether it would remain. And Naeli stood just inside the doorway again, not closing it, not leaving it open with intention, just letting it be as it was, the same way she had allowed the morning to unfold without forcing its meaning. Elijah remained a few steps behind her, not shifting closer, not stepping away, his presence steady but unclaimed, like something waiting to see if it would be accepted or forgotten. The heat of the day had settled fully now, pressing down across the land in long, slow waves, and the air inside the cabin carried that warmth in a way that softened the edges of everything. The walls, the floor, even the silence between them. Nayeli moved first, not toward him, not toward the door, but toward the small shelf along the wall where a few worn objects rested. Things that had not been moved in years, and she reached for one without hesitation, her fingers closing around a small piece of leather tied with a thin cord. Elijah watched without speaking, his eyes following the motion but not questioning it. And when she turned back toward him, the object rested lightly in her hand, its weight small but undeniable. "This was my husband's," she said, her voice calm, not heavy, not distant, just clear in a way that did not leave room for misunderstanding. Elijah's gaze settled on the leather, not reaching for it, not stepping closer, just acknowledging it as it was. Nayeli held it for a moment longer, then stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a way she had not done before, and stopped just short of touching him. He did not walk away, she continued, her eyes steady on his, even when he knew what it would cost him. The words did not accuse, they did not demand. They simply placed a truth into the space between them where it could not be avoided. Elijah felt it settle, not as a weight pressing down, but as something anchoring him where he stood, and he nodded once, slowly, not to agree, but to accept that what she said belonged there. Nayeli lifted the leather cord slightly, not offering it yet, just letting him see it clearly, and in that moment, the past was no longer something distant or hidden. It stood between them as plainly as the light in the room. "You were there," she said, and this time it was not a question, not even a statement that required an answer. It was simply the truth finding its place. Elijah did not look away, and that was the only answer she needed before he spoke. "Yes," he said, his voice low, steady, and without anything left to hide behind. The silence that followed did not break. It deepened, stretching between them in a way that made every breath feel deliberate, every movement chosen. Nayeli's hand did not shake. Her grip on the leather remained steady. But something behind her eyes shifted, not anger, not grief, but something quieter, something that had been waiting for this moment longer than she had allowed herself to admit. "You did not stop it," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. Elijah closed his eyes for the briefest second, not to escape, not to avoid, but because the truth of it did not need to be seen to be known. "No," he answered, and when he opened his eyes again, they held nothing but the same stillness she had seen from the beginning, the same refusal to step away from what he had been. Nayeli lowered her hand slightly, the leather resting against her palm now, and for a moment it seemed as though the valley itself had drawn closer, as though the distance outside had folded inward to meet what stood inside this small room. "Then why stand now?" she asked, and the question carried more weight than anything she had said before, not because it demanded an answer, but because it demanded truth. Elijah did not rush to respond, and in that pause, everything that had led them here seemed to gather into a single point, a single moment where nothing could be undone and nothing could be avoided. "Because I did not then," he said finally, and the simplicity of it held more than any explanation ever could. Nayeli studied him, not searching, not questioning, but seeing, and what she saw was not the man who had arrived at her door, not the stranger who had stood in her valley, but the man who had chosen to remain when leaving would have been easier, the man who had not hidden when the past found him again. The silence settled once more, but it was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was holding what already had. Nayeli looked down at the leather in her hand, her fingers tightening just slightly before relaxing again, and slowly, almost without thinking, she extended it toward him, not as a gift, not as forgiveness, but as something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name. Elijah did not reach for it immediately, and that hesitation mattered more than any quick acceptance ever could, because it showed that he understood what stood between them was not his to take, not his to claim, only his to face. The light shifted again, the heat settling deeper into the wood beneath their feet, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, because this was not a moment that could be rushed, not one that could be decided in a single breath. And in that stillness, in that quiet space where past and present met without needing to be forced together, the promise that had begun in silence took another shape, not spoken, not confirmed, but undeniable in the way it held them both exactly where they stood. The leather cord remained suspended between them, unmoving, as if even the smallest motion might break something that had taken too long to reach this point. And Nayeli did not pull it back, did not push it forward. She simply held it there, letting Elijah decide what it meant. And that was the difference now. Not force, not demand, but choice. Elijah looked at it, not as an object, not as something to take, but as something that carried a weight he had not yet earned the right to hold. And for a long moment he did nothing, his hands remaining at his sides, his breath steady but deliberate, as if even reaching for it required more than intention. Nayeli watched him closely, not measuring whether he would accept it, but how. Because the how mattered more than the act itself. And when Elijah finally moved, it was slow, careful, his hand lifting just enough to meet hers without closing over it, without claiming what she offered. His fingers brushed the leather, not taking it, just touching it. And that small contact carried more meaning than any word either of them could have spoken. The room seemed to still around them, the heat pressing gently against the walls, the light holding steady as if unwilling to move past this moment. Nayeli did not let go, not yet, and Elijah did not pull away. And for a brief second, the space between them was no longer distance. It was connection, fragile, uncertain, but real in a way neither of them could ignore. "This does not belong to you," Nayeli said quietly, her voice not sharp, not cold, but grounded in truth, and Elijah nodded before she had even finished speaking. Because he already understood. "I know," he replied, and his voice carried no argument, no attempt to change what she had said. Nayeli studied him for another moment, searching not for remorse, not for explanation, but for something simpler, something harder to fake. And what she saw was not a man asking to be forgiven, but a man who had already accepted that he might not be. Slowly, she closed her fingers around the leather again and lowered it, not taking it away, not rejecting him, just returning it to herself. And that action did not end the moment, it completed it. Elijah let his hand fall back to his side, the absence of contact lingering longer than the touch itself, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was nothing left between them that needed to be proven. The past had been named, the truth had been spoken, and what remained was not something either of them could force into shape. Nayeli stepped back then, not retreating, not creating distance out of fear, but allowing the space between them to settle into something new, something that did not belong to what had come before. "You cannot carry this," she said, her voice steady, her eyes holding his. "But you can choose what you do after it." Elijah absorbed the words in silence, not responding. Immediately, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to defend, only something to accept, and acceptance, he had learned, did not come with noise. He nodded once, slowly, the motion small but final, and in that nod there was no promise of redemption, no claim of change, only the quiet decision to stand where he was without turning away again. The wind moved softly through the doorway, lifting a thin layer of dust that caught the light before settling again, and the valley beyond stretched, wide and unchanged, as if nothing that had happened inside this small cabin had touched it at all. Nayeli turned toward the doorway, her gaze drifting out across the land she had always known, and for a moment she stood there in silence, the leather cord resting lightly in her hand, its presence no longer sharp, no longer cutting, but still real. Elijah did not follow her immediately. He remained where he was, giving the moment the space it needed, the same way he had from the beginning. And when he finally stepped forward, it was only enough to stand a few feet behind her, close enough to share the view, far enough to respect what had not yet been given. "You stayed," Nayeli said again, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as something that simply existed now, undeniable and unchanged. Elijah did not answer this time, because he did not need to. The truth of it stood in the space between them stronger than any repetition could make it. The sun shifted slightly, casting a new angle of light across the valley floor, and the long shadows that had stretched through the morning were gone, replaced by something clearer, something harder to hide within. Nayeli let out a slow breath. Her shoulders easing just enough to show the weight she had been carrying had shifted, not disappeared, but moved into a place she could bear. "Then you will learn," she said quietly, her voice softer now, though no less certain. And Elijah felt those words settle into him in a way nothing else had, not as instruction, not as judgment, but as something closer to direction than he had known in a long time. Neither of them spoke again after that, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The silence had done its work, had carried them through everything words could not hold, and what remained was not resolution, not closure, but something quieter, something that would take time to understand, time to shape, time to become whatever it was meant to be. And in that stillness, with the past no longer hidden and the future not yet claimed, the promise that had begun without a single word finally found its ground, not in what was taken, not in what was given, but in what was chosen to remain. The valley did not change when the day leaned toward evening. It simply softened, the harsh light giving way to something quieter, something that let the land breathe again. And Nayeli stood at the doorway as the shadows began to stretch long across the ground, her eyes following the slow shift of light, as if it might carry answers that words could not. Behind her, Elijah moved with the same care he had shown since the beginning, not filling the space, not claiming it, just learning its rhythm. One step at a time, the creak of the floor beneath his boots no longer foreign, but not yet familiar either. The heat of the day began to fade, replaced by a cooler air that slipped through the open doorway, brushing against skin and wood alike, and for the first time since morning, the valley felt at rest. Nayeli turned slightly, her gaze settling on Elijah not with suspicion, not with distance, but with something quieter, something that did not ask for answers anymore. The nights are colder. Here, she said, her voice calm, not offering, not warning, simply stating what was true. Elijah nodded once, understanding the weight behind even the simplest words now, because nothing she said came without meaning. I have known colder, he replied, and though the words were simple, there was something beneath them that spoke of places far from this valley, places he had already left behind. Nayeli studied him for a moment longer, then turned back toward the horizon where the sun dipped lower, painting the land in tones of amber and shadow, and in that fading light, everything seemed less defined, less certain, but also less guarded. Cold is not always from the air, she said quietly, and Elijah felt that settle deeper than anything else she had spoken, because it was not about the night, not about the valley, but about what a person carried when the world grew quiet. He did not answer, not because he had nothing to say, but because some truths did not need to be spoken twice. The wind moved again, gentler now, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant stone, and Nayeli stepped outside, her feet finding the ground without hesitation, as if the land itself recognized her and made space. Elijah followed after a moment, not stepping beside her, but just behind, keeping the distance that had come to define them, not as a barrier, but as respect. The sky above stretched wide and endless, the first hint of dusk settling into its edges, and the valley lay still beneath it, untouched by what had passed through earlier that day. Nayeli walked a few steps forward, then stopped, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the ridge, something only she could see, something tied to memory more than place. Elijah watched her in silence, not asking, not interrupting, just present in the way he had chosen to be. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost carried by the wind itself. He used to stand there, she said, her gaze unmoving. At this time, every day, watching the light leave the valley, Elijah followed the line of her sight, though he could not see what she saw, could not feel what that place held for her, but he understood enough to remain still, to let the moment belong to her without stepping into it. He believed the land remembers, she continued. Not in the way people do, not with names or faces, but with presence, Elijah. Let those words settle, not trying to measure them, not trying to answer them, just allowing them to exist as they were. Nayeli turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his once more, and there was something different in them now, not lighter, not softer, but clearer, as if something that had been held too tightly had finally been set down. If that is true, she said, then it will remember today as well. Elijah held her gaze, understanding what she meant without needing her to explain it. Because this day had not been about what was taken or what was lost, but about what had been faced and what had not been turned away from. Then let it remember, he said, his voice quiet, but certain, and there was no need to add anything more. Naeli watched him for a long second, then nodded once, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of something that no longer needed to be questioned. The sun slipped lower, the light fading into a deeper shade of gold before giving way to the first quiet blue of evening, and the valley held that transition the same way it held everything else, without resistance, without judgment, just letting it be. Naeli turned back toward the cabin, her steps unhurried, her presence no longer guarded in the way it had been that morning, and Elijah followed again, not beside her, not ahead, just there, part of the rhythm now. When they reached the doorway, she paused for a brief second, then stepped inside, leaving it open behind her as she had before, and Elijah stood at the threshold, the same place he had first been allowed to cross, the same line that had once separated everything, and now held something entirely different. He looked out over the valley one last time, the fading light stretching across the land, the silence settling into its evening shape, and then he stepped inside, not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen to remain without asking what it would cost. The door did not close. It did not need to, because what stood between them was no longer something that could be shut away, and as the night began to settle over the valley, quiet and unbroken, the promise that had never been spoken found its final form, not in words, not in gestures, but in the simple, unchanging truth that neither of them had walked away. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.